Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa.
We have a really wonderful guest with us today. We're a little bit biased because we both have worked with the same incredible PR person, Amanda Schumacher, who makes magical things happen. And so we are connected by that thread. We are also connected by the thread of the many, many women out there doing work around motherhood, around rebalancing the domestic workload, around creating more connected families, people like Lauren Smith Brody, people like Eve Rodsky. And Neha Ruch is with us to really, it's a very profound moment because you and I are at a different stage of parenting than many of the people she works with. We are sort of like 21, 22 years in this very long journey. And the way Neha thinks about it and talks about it is born of her having worked with tens and tens of thousands of women over the last decade as they consider motherhood and career, pausing, re-entering, all of that. And I found it really moving and beautiful to be in conversation with her.
Yeah, I mean, she comes at her work via an MBA and a career in marketing. She writes about this very openly, that she was ambitious, I think, in all the good ways. I don't think that's a bad word. She was ambitious. She was hardworking. She wanted all of the accolades of the workplace, and then ended up making a very active choice to step back from the workplace, and had kids. And then as her young kids were growing up, so she was a young parent or a parent to young kids at the time, she founded a community called Mother Untitled. It's now a platform, frankly, it's the leading platform for similarly like-minded women who are leaning into family life and trying to figure out that balance. And that led to the book that she is launching called The Power Pause, which, I mean, full disclosure, when it arrived and I didn't remember what it was about, I thought it was about menopause, but it's not. It's about work pause, totally different pause. But it's about redefining how we do or don't choose to work and what work means and how we value ourselves and how society values us. And, you know, I was a little jealous. I'm not going to lie. I was a little jealous of Neha for having done some of this deep thinking while her kids were young, because it's deep thinking that we should all do in order to give ourselves grace in the process of trying to balance working, the financial needs of a family, and the logistical, tactical, and emotional needs of a family in having an adult around. I think you'll love this conversation. I think you'll love this book.
Hi, Neha. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Hi, it's so nice to be here.
You are a Wonder Woman, and I know you're going to push back on that term, but let me define how I'm using that term, and then we can dive into our conversation. With your work with Mother Untitled, with your work with The Power Pause, you are changing the narrative about motherhood, about work, about making choices for ourselves and our families. And you're part of this conversation with so many incredible people who we love and admire and have interviewed. Our podcast, we could have like a sub podcast of all these incredible women having these conversations. Tell us about the heart of your mission. Tell us about what your goal is with all this work.
Oh, that's very kind. I feel the same about everyone in that sweet little circle that you described. I really hope that on the other side of this, that we have validated another option for women in work and family. You know, my goal is never to say a career pause or a career break for family life is the right choice. It's to say it is another choice that some women need or want to make, and they should not be counted out for making that choice. Because I witnessed in my own life, and now I've witnessed over 8 years among, hundreds of thousands of women's lives, that they are growing, they are participating, they have so much to give on the other side. And I think this culture has for too long written them off. And so the goal is just that one day when our children wake up, when we ask them stay at home or working mother, they never understand what that means. They just think that there's just sort of a range of incredible choices, and they're sort of getting to choose what's right for right now.
Right. I mean, you've redefined this work-life bit from binary to just a spectrum of very flexible roles that are influenced by all these different pieces, right? Including your own freedom and ability to make the choice, right? And sometimes necessity gets in the way of this choice, which you write about very powerfully. And you talk about it in terms of women, and you're an advocate about it in terms of women, but you make lots of references too to how this same spectrum applies to men, right? And so this idea that in 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're all looking at a gigantic spectrum of ways to be in the world and ways to label ourselves is really powerful. Why do you think the phrase stay-at-home mom is so loaded?
I mean, you both can speak to this from your own lives, right? If you go back to the 1970s and the 1960s, when women were just entering the workforce, there was this incredible desire to prove our capacity in the workforce. And unfortunately, what that did was it left anyone choosing or needing to be at home with a caricature from the 1970s, right? With this sort of June Cleaver archetype that I describe in the book. And then we sort of progressed in the 80s and 90s, and then we saw the mommy wars start to emerge, right? Which is that one side of the equation was working out of the home and represented the modern, ambitious woman, and anyone who is choosing otherwise was left defending tradition. And what we see now is the reality is women are having children 10 years older than the women in 1970. So I think the average age across the country, according to census data, is 30. And that obviously gets higher on the coast. You're looking at women who have clocked in education experience and work experience. They have equitable relationships with their partners, like you described. We see men spending 3 times the amount of time with their children than any generation prior. They have access to digital tools and technology, so they're able to stay connected and creative and contributing on a flexible basis, even in their chapters at home. And so none of it matches the archetype, right? We're looking at a whole new dynamic version of the modern woman who's, by the way, choosing to make room for family life in a multitude of ways. And add to the point of the spectrum, we're looking at data that shows us that 1 in 3 women who are working out of the home currently are planning on pause in the next 2 years. 1 in 2 are considering downshifting their working hours. 90% of the women who are currently at home are aiming to return to the workforce. So it's just, the static image from yesteryear just doesn't apply.
So let's talk about the population that we work with and who we love so much, who are the parents of tweens, teens, and young adults. Mm-hmm. And when your kids are younger, you think it cannot get any harder. You are physically exhausted, and people with older kids will stop you on the street when you have your stroller, you're in the grocery store, and they'll say, "Oh, enjoy it now because it gets so much harder." And you think, how could it possibly get any harder than this? And then your kids get older and they enter this next phase of life, and it's not physically exhausting, but it is emotionally exhausting. It is mentally taxing. And we hear really often about people taking a pause or leaving the workforce for a time when their kids are at this stage, not at the I just had a baby and I'm taking maternity leave. Tell us a little bit about, so we hear that anecdotally all the time because those are our people. When you interviewed folks for the book and in your Mother Untitled community, what are you hearing from the parents of kids that age?
So it's interesting. One of the big gripes, I can say this now, maybe I can't, about my book cover was that it has a parent on with a stroller. And the reality that I found in both interviews and research is that majority of women do not pause their paid work right on the heels of maternity leave. Mm-hmm. It's actually during transition points. So you see it a lot when parents shift into becoming a parent of multiples, where maybe they had established a childcare system or some sort of version of quote unquote balance that worked with one child and it no longer works with two, and they need to recalibrate. You see it during moves and real family relocations. And then another one is when their children enter a different stage of needs. Mm-hmm. And so needs can be qualified and classified in a multitude of ways, right? We're seeing a rise, and you both can speak to this more eloquently than I can, of neurodivergence, mental health issues, and then just plain adolescence. And then another one, which was really interesting to me, was college applications. And I don't know for how long that's going to apply. That's for another podcast. But the reality is you're looking at a series of times where family demands uptick. And one of the things I think a lot about is this idea of want versus need, right? So oftentimes, if it is a privilege to choose, right? Let me caveat this by saying that 1 in 3 women feel like they're forced to pause because they can't offset the cost of childcare. So now assuming that we're talking about a population for whom they want to be at home, oftentimes that is when their kids are babies. Mm-hmm. When you're looking at the kids getting older, I heard more interviews of people saying it was a need. There was, especially around the 2nd and 3rd grade when diagnoses start cropping up, you saw a big uptick there. And I think what's interesting that you and I, can all meet on is this idea that at this point, $231.6 million of parenting books are released every year, which just underscores the reality that parenting is just intellectual labor, right? And we are navigating such intense times that it demands a lot for us. And what parents all say is they need the headspace later on. They need the emotional capacity. And so oftentimes what they're shifting isn't necessarily for time, but headspace.
I want to paint a picture for those who are dubious about why, when your kid is older and they're in school from 8 until 3, and maybe they have extracurricular activities, how could you possibly need to spend time? So, I would love, my head immediately goes to all of the things that kids in need, various definitions of need to be at during the school day, right? So the logistics, literally the logistics of getting a kid from a school to an outside resource, either during school hours or right after school hours, which doesn't always line up well with employment. Is that the main reason? Are there another thing that comes to mind for me is when kids, especially with chronic health conditions or including chronic mental health conditions, when those kids are not in school and when they're at home and they can't be at home alone when they're managing something that requires an adult around. So those are the things that come into my head that make that statement a no-brainer. Are there other things that I'm missing there in terms of why the need grows as kids grow?
So you're looking at the outside cases, right? In the extreme scenarios, and not even extreme because as you know, those rates are going up where there are special needs outside of school and unique demands to the family. But if you look at the data, you're looking at 87% of parents wanting to pause because they simply want more time with their child. It's as simple as that. 60% say it's the finances. In between, it's less family stress. And so what they're doing during that period, and let's like all be honest, right? With school closures, I forget what the exact number was of how many days the kids were actually in school in the month of November and December, but it's low. It's very low relative to what you think it is. So of course there's managing the sheer calendar, but between those hours of, let's call it realistically 9 to 2, right? 9 to 2:30, because everything else, there's the family administration of the signups and the shuffling and the paying of the bills. We know that women who are in this position of household management are taking care of the like general household care and administration, right? Then there's the advocacy work that we underestimate. But I just got off some community events in the Midwest. And the number of women I talked to who just needed to put in place, sit on the phone with the insurance company for coverage for occupational therapy or for a child's diabetes. And so those are not outside cases. Those are, at this point, the norm, right? So now you're looking at the time spent on that side of the equation, which, by the way, what I love about that story is how dare we ever question that woman's ambition who's sitting there negotiating with some of the top insurers in the country to make sure that her child is covered, right? The level of communication, empathy, patience cultivated in those day-to-day scenarios, right? And then there's this other side of also wanting to just preserve some amount of time and margin so that you can continue to grow and stay connected in whatever capacity, which I think so often women, and I see, a big number of women who suddenly feel anxiety when their children start kindergarten because they're like, oh, well, now I need to go back to work. And like, I took this pause to raise my child. And you also took that pause to grow alongside your family. And you have the right and permission to get to do that. And you have the right and permission to stay whole and healthy because we undervalue that. And I see it also come through where, parents will say, like, I need the bare minimum of childcare to get through. Never thinking like I could use a little bit of childcare to be able to network myself or take that online certification class and be able to reinvest this time, not only to your own health, but also using this chapter to figure out what comes next. So I would argue that those hours available, sadly, 70% will go to the family administration, but you deserve that 30% of time to reinvest back into yourself.
So Neha, let's talk for a minute. If people are considering a pause, what would you want them to be thinking about, to keep in mind? Things like financial planning. You talk in the book really specifically about steps that you would advise people to take as they consider it. Not waiting until things are unsustainable and you have to just get the hell out, but being able to plan ahead and communicate and lay the groundwork. Give us some of your sort of golden nuggets of advice for people to plan ahead and really do this in a thoughtful and deliberate way.
I'm thinking about how this is unique to your audience, but it's not. It's anyone making a pause or shift, by the way, in their financial income and their work for pay, because inevitably there will be changes in who's making more. And so I think the number one mindset shift is to reframe this idea that one partner is depending on the other partner for pay and income, and to shift the mindset this is an interdependent organization. One partner who might be bringing in the income is contributing that labor and pay to the household. And the other partner who may be taking on more of the home and the family care is allowing that other person to single task in the workforce without having to worry about that, right? And that has incredible value. And so I think if you can step into a chapter of any type of shift with that mindset, and know that you're both aligned on that, what that allows you to do is then be able to navigate the day-to-day, knowing that A, you feel that financial dignity and security. B, you hopefully have a plan in which you're budgeting and making budget allocations, and you're not the only one making lifestyle adjustments, because realistically, you both decided that one person was going to take this in. And then the last part, which I think comes up later, is that we talked a little bit about health. So often women feel like if they're not working for pay, they don't get to invest in care. And the reality is if a partner is not working for pay, they still deserve to be healthy and supported. And the whole family deserves that. But it starts with that sort of foundational piece.
You encourage people to really think about what do they need? Not just how can they survive, but what do they need? What are what forms of exercise or mental health care or friendship connections or things like that do they need? Because so often, I was home on and off for 10 years and it was like, you just feel like you're just getting by. And I knew enough that I went back to school and got a master's because I needed the intellectual stimulation. I needed to be out in the world as a human being, but I didn't approach it thoughtfully. I wasn't like, oh, what do I want my week to look like? And you warn against thinking of things in the day-to-day, right? Because the day-to-day can be shit show to shit show, and then you can have 3 sunny days and it's awesome. And the week on the whole is fine. But the deliberateness, I so appreciate your approach to the deliberateness, but there's not just the financial concern. Some people are concerned about the stability of their marriages as part of this calculus. And I just would love for you to speak to that in this context of planning ahead and thinking ahead. What's your advice to people who are in a tough spot in their marriage on top of thinking about a pause?
I obviously call it out in the book in a pretty big gray box, but if you are in a rocky marriage, this may not be the time to pause. If you need or want to, right? If there are special circumstances that necessitate that, what can you do to scaffold yourself so that you can at least focus on day-to-day of caregiving, taking care of your marriage and potentially reconciling, but know that you're safe. I talk pretty openly about postnuptial agreements. I think that they've gotten a sad stigma in this country, but all it is putting pen to paper that you are both in agreement of the value you're contributing to the house, that you both agree that each parent should be supported and respected on the other side if the marriage were not to work out. It protects the entire family's, it protects the entire family's health and sanity. If things go off the rails, it allows you to go in with a plan and not try to wing it later on, right? And I think in the end, that is a very intuitive decision that as you're deciding to make this shift, you have to be really honest with, is this a partner who will respect me if in the case of the worst case scenario? If not, what can we start to formalize to make sure that we both feel safe, right? So there's sort of this spectrum. You can be going in and think like, I am rock solid, or I have independent means, or we're keeping our funds separate and I feel fine. Either way, I think having the deliberate conversations, creating a budget. So I talk in the book about how the ideal is 6 months, right? And, my husband and I, this is like very nerdy of us, and this is not me, this was all him, of like, we sit down at the beginning of the year, we like model out our life, figure out what cash is coming in, what cash is going out. But you're making, and I don't necessarily think it has to be that overblown, but I do think having a deliberate conversation about us making investments that align with our values, and then how we're going to make sure that we're both supported. And if during that process you see red flags, yellow flags, that might be a time that we're bringing in extra help, whether that's a marital counselor or a financial planner. There are resources available to formalize those contracts. And it doesn't need to be the post-nup. I just want to make clear that that is a very sound and valid option. That doesn't mean you're betting against your marriage. It means you're betting on yourself and keeping yourself safe.
Neha, I just want you to know that when I read about your date night with your husband every January, going through your budget, date day and night, date marathon.
Yeah.
I immediately pitched it to mine, and he was like, that sounds awful, but we're totally doing it. Neha, reading your book, I had my own personal epiphany. And the epiphany was that I took a pause. I didn't know I had taken a pause. I went from being in practice to a writing career to being an entrepreneur. And the way I always described myself was perpetually employed. Even if I wasn't really employed, if there was an idea brewing in the back of my head, it was an idea that I defined as being employed or employable. And it was a huge part of my sense of accomplishment and my sense of identity. And when I read the Power Pause and I started to really assess my own life choices, what I realized I had done was take several mini pauses throughout my career. I had the luck and fortune of taking many mini pauses where I could stop and reassess and decide how I wanted to apply my skill set. But really, what was I doing? I was with my kids. And really what was driving me, it was that as a pediatrician, I knew everyone else's kids and I didn't know my own. And then when I was writing, I would shut my door to get work done and I would shut my kids out. And then I was like, what am I doing? I'm writing about parenting. And it took reading your book for me to give myself permission to acknowledge that taking pauses from work doesn't take away all of the hard work you did to get to the place you were at work. So like taking a pause didn't take away my MD, right? It was like a refuel, but the world has such a strong narrative that refuels don't work or they're counter. And so I just want to start by saying thank you for that because it was an unbelievable moment when reading. But I do want to just ask a quick question related to it, which is, do you have any words of wisdom to help parents retain their identity as they're pressing pause?
Cara, I remember that about your story. And I actually also remember you not necessarily talking about it as a pause. And I think that's okay. I think that what's amazing for you is that you allowed yourself to exist in the gray and see, and of course you are employable. I think you acknowledged what I want women to acknowledge, that you had a lot to give and that, yes, you are growing up alongside your kids, but you had your hands in a lot of different things. And I think that in and of itself is the mindset that we want women to have. And I think this, you asked what I think a lot of women walk up against is, okay, I'm stepping into this chapter of at-home parenthood, or I'm breaking up with my career for a chapter. And that has been sort of all my worth has been wrapped up in this pithy statement about who I am and what I do. And now what am I? And so they start defaulting to, I'm just a mom. And we never want to hear that, right? We never want anyone to think they're just a mom because, of course, there's inherent leadership training that goes with that. But we also want them to see themselves, truly believe that when they're pausing their career, they're not pausing their life. And that actually, whether they chose or they didn't choose, they get to own this stage of life as a chapter that they get to carve out their own independent goals that finally are detached from their employer, but that are truly authentic to themselves, right? But when you are employed, it might be cases won or accounts received, whatever that may be. There's sort of very easy success metrics assigned to you. When we step into mostly motherhood, it very quickly becomes like how well behaved our kids are. And we all know, especially me, sadly, that my children are not the most dependable metric of my success and commitment as a parent. And so, I learned that the hard way, let me be clear. But I also think it was when I learned it and I sort of challenged myself, and I obviously walk women through this, when I challenged myself to write my own independent goals for personal, professional, or creative and family goals, it gave me a sense of this stage of life. I can optimize my day-to-day or not in a day-to-day, but week to week for myself too. And that is how I am still moving forward. It dignified my time.
But Neha, we're so bad at it. We're so bad at thinking about what what do we want? Who are we, not in relationship to other people or institutions or the external goals? I mean, part of what you're asking us all to do in a really beautiful way is to untrain ourselves from decades of socialization of who do we put first? How do we think of our goals? What do we want for the coming year? You know, if someone says to me, what do you hope for the coming year? All I can think about is what I want for other members of my family. It's like this crazy, we put ourselves last so often. And so,
but you get joy from that.
Oh, I mean,
yeah.
Also, like, it's my effing job to help people think about their families. But my point is, I'm not saying it that I'm sorry about that. But what I'm saying is when we ask people, like we interviewed Harlan Cohen, who works with people around kids, college students and their parents. And he says, you know, write the story of this year. I want you to imagine it's a year from now. Write that story. What does that story look like? And he said, part of what people have trouble with is wanting. People are scared to want. They're scared to reach for it. They're scared. And every stage of my leaving being a stay-at-home parent and going back into the workforce of starting a business or going into partnership with Cara, every stage of that was terrifying to me. I hadn't written a resume in 10 years. We're going to talk about LinkedIn. Like the first time I got on LinkedIn, I had like almost wet my pants with fear, right?
Totally.
The first time we did a Zoom during COVID, I was like terrified. I was going to like forget to do something or mess it up. Like every stage of this return or shift or pivot or reentry or removal, whatever part you're at, is filled with real fear and worried, and we're not socialized. Like we have to like build ourselves stronger to be able to manage that.
You know, it's so interesting. I wish I could say that it was easy. Like you read a book and you suddenly let go of what everyone else thinks, right? Like
nice.
That would be amazing. I do think Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz is an excellent book that helps you really like be able to hold people's judgments. Because if that's sort of one of the things that sort of haunts us the most. But I also think going back to your point about like, but my job is to take care of other people. I think it's about saying, yes, that exists. And you're allowed to hold space for yourself too, right? It's not saying one is more important than the other. I think the very act of just allowing yourself a little bit of time to consider yourself and where you would like to be in 3 or 10 years isn't in replacement of the day-to-day of taking care of a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old. It's so that you can remain a whole and forward-moving individual next to that 15-year-old or 5-year-old, right? And so, you know, no part of me putting pen to paper and saying my personal goal for this chapter is to rewire my reactivity. Took away from me being a parent. In quite the contrary, oftentimes our children, whether they're toddlers or teenagers, compel us to do that deepest work, right? They shine a light on, oh, that's that thing that, by the way, I was able to hide from every boss at every prestigious firm I worked at, but my 2-year-old or my 5-year-old or my now 9-year-old can like get me there. And so I need to do that work. And so I guess to the point of using the stage of life to do the work that you will never get to do in any other format. Right.
When they asked my nursery school kid, they were like, what does your parent do all day while you're at school? And one of my kids said, oh, she drinks coffee.
That's so sweet.
That's what you do.
Also, but I was like, dude, I do so much more than drink coffee. So I think it is the exercise of verbalizing it, of pen to paper, and you have some exercises in the book. I just want people to know we don't imagine that these steps are easy. As Neha said, if it was easy, we would all just read a book and everything would be fine. It's scary, it's hard, but you have to start somewhere.
And I would say that sounds really big, right? Like just take the personal one. Of course, I had my creative goal, which was start this platform and be a culture changer around this narrative. That started with 3 blog posts on Squarespace during nap time
Right.
a week, right? Like, so it was tiny seeds. And with reactivity, it was listen to a podcast one time a week, right? That was as much as I could do. With my family goal, it was, we wanted to infuse more silliness. So it was have a dance party one Monday a week, right? Like start the week off on that note. Yes, it's about setting these goals and backing into them. You know, you mentioned the picture your ideal. I call it the ideal day exercise, but people call it differently. In 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. And that will often help you crystallize like what your real goals are.
Mm-hmm.
But actually for your audience, this was interesting. I was in Charlottesville with a group of women, and they were actually old. They had older kids. And one of them had a 17 and 15-year-old. And she said, I finally want to take on this thing I've always wanted to do. But I was a really, she was at Bain. She was at a top 5 consulting firm for a long time. And she'd been so in relationship with her parents for so long, who had given her so much respect for that role. And now she said she wanted to experiment with being a florist. And having to let go of that and take that bet on herself was so hard. But she said, how can I get myself there? I said, write your eulogy. Like, forget the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, write your eulogy, because I guarantee no one's going to be talking about you having worked at Bain. Right. Like that.
That's so true.
And it's so morbid, but sometimes you really have to extrapolate, like, in the end, how do I want, like, I finally have this stage of life where I'm not on a ladder. So I might as well just call it and figure out what comes next and really open it up. And that's what I want women to feel, this sense of possibility.
Well, I mean, in order to do that though, and you talk about this in not these terms, but you're a branding person, marketing person. So I feel like you'll appreciate these terms. I mean, the whole concept needs a rebrand, right? And that's, yes, this is all this individual work and effort is critical, but also we need a larger social shift that honors all of these types of choices. And that's hard. That's happening. We're in conversation here. There are lots of conversations like these happening all over the place. But it's going to take a while for the bow of the ship to point in a new direction. Let's just get right into why adult friendships are so important. You talk about it in the Power Pause. You actually talk about it and quote a friend of our podcast, Jenny Wallace, about why parents shouldn't go things alone, don't have to go things alone. So we always say, Vanessa has this great line when we're in front of huge audiences. She says, you need your trusted adult too, at which point everyone cracks up and sort of funny, but completely true. Talk us through it.
I mean, you both know this, just in terms of the work that you're doing together, right? It's so much easier when it feels like you're in it together, when you can normalize the ups and downs. And then when you step into parenthood, like Jenny says, there are going to be natural ups and downs. And if you are able to spend, I mean, she correlates it to her data around healthy, striving families, right? Where what she sees is that in the healthy, striving families, the mother spends 1 hour of time a week with another peer. And Molly Millwood, I think, cites research around how it actually releases a cortisol suppressant so that you're reducing your stress when you're around one another. And that's all incredible. I think that there's another side of it, which, you know, if I think about the Power Pause as a roadmap for women walking through this stage of life, I think so often, not only do we glean so much identity from the titles we carry or the work that we do, but it's also who we spend our time with. And people sort of like to suggest that your network, both your professional and your personal, dry up in motherhood, right? We've seen these memes of it being so incredibly lonely. And I would venture to say there are lonely moments, but actually there are more environments that are conducive to deep connections in parenthood, right? Because you are connecting in a place where there's an invisible thread. There's like small talk is easy because you have children sort of crawling around you or navigating the similar classroom. And if you can actively start seeing this as a place where you can network and think about this not in the term of like, I need a mom gang or crew, but really I need a handful of relationships that serve a multitude of reasons for a season, right? Like I had friends who lived in the building that I had my kids when they were little. And now I have friends who, I'm able to do this work alongside or raise kids alongside, in my kids' school. And they all sort of get a different part of me. And I think that's, in this world of, we will watch Instagram, and one of the many things that Instagram does is it sort of gives us this social composite of what the idealized motherhood looks like. And one of them is that you have this like traveling crew of 8 besties that you go to brunch with every Monday. And like, that's amazing. I don't know anyone who has succeeded in building that. And I think that the more interesting stories are the people who are able to pick that one friend that they like to bounce ideas around with, right? I have this woman I interviewed for the book. Her name is Priscilla Musion from Napa. She was at home with her 5-year-old and she started feeling that itch. And so she found a friend who at a book club, she's an introvert, but she put herself in this book club just so she could find, some camaraderie. And they ended up setting up what she calls these sort of backyard burrito sessions where they would bounce ideas off of each other until they sort of had a clearer sense of what came next. And that to me is this idea that you are, I don't know if they're still friends. I don't know if she even, but that was so meaningful for her in that stage.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I think about is pairing another way to take care of yourself. So I have a dear friend who I ran with as I was getting back in shape after having a baby. We would go on long runs and we would talk about work stuff, right? So it was like we were taking care of ourselves emotionally. We were taking care of ourselves physically. For those people listening, for whose kids' friendships have shifted, and the people who were their people for a long time are no longer their people because the kids aren't friends anymore, or they moved away and they're seeking new connection, you're not alone. It's really common for parents of kids in the age group that we work with to have to refine connection and friendships. And in the book, Neha, you talk about all sorts of ways about finding community, finding purpose, finding human connection. But I just want to validate for people who are feeling a little bit lonely right now in this moment of transition and change and uncertainty, you're not alone. And there are other people like you seeking that connection, seeking that, not a crew, not a posse, but just one or two other people who can listen to you non-judgmentally and bounce ideas off with you, and really validate your experience at a time when it feels pretty up and down. Neha, we're going to wrap just, first of all, with an expression of gratitude for what you're doing. But if you wanted people to walk away with just one idea, and I'm sure you've got a lot of people's brains sort of whirring, WHIRRING, in case that didn't make any sense to anyone listening. What do you want them to walk away with?
I think that because we didn't get to the part around like reentry, which is the big sort of question mark that hangs over so many women's head, I want people to know that we are shifting to a world where there's a career portfolio mindset, right? Where it includes all of that the traditional experience, that you accrued, which is so valid and so powerful and doesn't evaporate. And then in this career sabbatical that you're taking for family life or career shift, you are going to grow in incredible ways, whether you're put a pen to paper or not. And if I ask you to do one thing, it's take stock of those, right? Keep a spreadsheet, keep a notes app in your phone. And every time you feel proud of yourself, whether it was, you won that insurance claim with their insurer, or you advise your husband or partner on a business decision at work, make note of it, because one day when you do feel ready, you can start to connect the dots back and call out the pieces that were really interesting and profound and were still incredible value and and skill. And so, I encourage you to just remember your story is still growing in this stage of life, and it's sort of yours to claim and tell.
Beautiful. Thank you, Neha.
Thank you, Neha.
I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.